What's Pro Football Focus doing? Last week they had Brady. This week they got Brady.
We're literally doing it differently from everybody else.
As a matter of fact, moving forward from this point on, I will not make reference to PFF.
Ready to get into it?
Yeah.
All right. We're going team by team.
I would be very careful about slinging stuff.
Am I going to get sued?
You got legal on this?
Let's send you out on the right note. PFF sucks. Have a great day, everybody.
Wow. Welcome into the NFL, the PFF NFL Show. Where are we? Thursday, July 25th. Almost there. Almost through to the regular season. Myself and the great Dalton Wasserman were just talking about that before we went on. We've almost made it, Dalton. We are at training camp. Steve, right now, is live at Patriots training camp, having already entered the practice facility via the wrong entrance, went in through the players' tunnel, apparently. The chances are he's going to get thrown out of the place, thrown in jail. Something terrible happened. But presumably next week we'll find out what he saw from Patriots camp. But we are here. Training camps are upon us, which means the NFL season is just around the corner. And how's it going, good sir?
Pretty good. You can feel that itch coming on whether you're sneaking into training camps or if you're a sicko like me and you were up till 2 a.m. watching Holy Cross tape between college and NFL, both coming less than a month down the pipe, man. It's you start to feel it, right? And I love my baseball, but the football itch is like starting to get there. It's like too close, man, to like not start thinking about the start of it.
Yeah, so today on the show, we're going to be kind of predicting the outcomes, the seasons for all the teams with new head coaches. You know, the coaching carousel being what it is, basically, a quarter of the NFL teams change coach this offseason. So we're going to run through them team by team and kind of give a little outlook of what we expect from those new head coach teams and really dive into where we expect those teams to fall in this season. But before we do that, we got to tell you about our friends over at Fabric. As parents, we all want our kids to grow up and be happy, successful, and financially independent. With a UGMA account from Fabric by Gerber Life, you're arming your child with a powerful financial tool to help shape their journey towards financial success. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes with as little as $1 a day. Then you can manage your child's UGMA account and monitor their investments right from your phone. There are no contribution limits, multiple tax advantages, and they're SIPC insured up to $500,000. Plus, no commission fees and just a low, flat monthly maintenance fee. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. That's meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. MEET fabric.com/PFFNFL. Portfolio is managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Monthly minimum contribution requirement. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, Dalton, let's start off. For a start, we're not counting the Raiders as a new head coach team, right? We're giving Antonio Pierce credit for the half a season's worth of interim head coach. He counts as a continuity hire. We're not counting the Raiders with a new head coach. But let's start with Atlanta, I guess. New head coach, one of the kind of biggest teams, I guess, of the offseason because they bring in Kirk Cousins, they make the free agency splash, and then they make probably the biggest move of the draft as well in terms of surprise factor with the Michael Penix Jr. Pick in the first round. So what do you expect to happen from the new head coach, Raheem Morris, and the Atlanta Falcons?
They should fully expect to contend for a division title, right? When you think about they won 7 games last year and we're still in contention for the division title in Week 18 with being the worst passing grade in the league as a team, the worst turnover-worthy play rate in the league as a team. Obviously, this is between Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke mostly. The third worst adjusted completion percentage. You're replacing what was the worst quarterback situation in the league with now a top 10 starter in Kirk Cousins. He's usually somewhere between the 8th and 10th best starter. Plus Michael Penix, obviously they got for the future, right? And he's arguably the most pro-ready passer in this year's draft if he needed to come in immediately and play if something was wrong with Cousins' Achilles or he falters for any reason. But that alone, look, their defense got a lot better last year, and I wouldn't expect that to be any difference with Raheem Morris in there. They had the third best offensive line in football, and you've really got a stacked group of weapons that now they added Darnell Mooney to. They probably could have used one more receiver, which was the argument for taking, say, Aroma Dunze in the draft, but just like the Jets last year before Rodgers tore his Achilles, you've got a team that had all the other pieces in place to win this division, and now you fix the worst part of it by adding a top 10 quarterback as long as he's healthy. I would fully expect them to contend for a division title.
Yeah, I honestly think the Cousins signing on its own puts them in the playoffs. Like, the Cousins signing puts them probably winning the division and being like a legitimate contender in that conference. The offense, the reason I think everyone was so frustrated last year is that you look at the skill position players that they've got, the Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Bijan Robinson, even the sort of lower down guys on the depth chart, and you're like, this is a playoff caliber group, but they have the worst quarterback situation in football, and obviously that's letting it all down. Now you bring in Cousins. The offensive line is really good. It's arguably, a top 3 unit in the NFL now. So the line is great. The skill position players are great. The quarterback is good. Maybe he's not great. Okay, he's 35 coming off an Achilles. That's at least an unknown variable here. And theoretically, you've upgraded the kind of offensive scheme and coaching as well by bringing in Zach Robinson, former PFF analyst, but also former, Sean McVay protege, those types of things. The offense should cook. It should be really, really good. And then you just have the defense, which still does look like a work in progress, but matters less, I think, if the offense is amazing. Like, if Cousins propels that offense to being one of the better units in the NFL, it doesn't matter that much that the defense isn't great. Maybe that stops them, making real noise once they get to the postseason. But based off the kind of baseline of this division, it shouldn't be enough to stop them winning it.
I agree, and I think you make a great point about Zach Robinson because it's the same offense that Kirk Cousins has played in for his entire career, right? The Shanahans and the Kubiaks, then Kevin O'Connell, and now Zach Robinson. Nothing changes for Kirk. He just has to get in there and get used to newer personnel and all that stuff, and you still have a great offensive line protecting him. And I think their defense is an interesting thing because they did play a lot better last year, right? They were second in the league in run defense grade. That was a big focus last year. Even though the previous coaching staff is gone, you still have good players, right, like Jesse Bates and even A.J. Terrell on the back end. They're just putting a big focus on the defensive line right now, right? If they get any sort of pass rush going, they drafted Braylon Trice and Brandon Dorless, guys who should get some young talent up there in the pass rush, even though they lost Calais Campbell. You're talking about a really dangerous team. If they get a pass rush going, now they've got a two-way go where their offense obviously should look better with the new coaching staff and with Cousins. And their defense much improved last year. If it takes another step with mostly the same crew other than Calais Campbell, you're talking about a team that should be the clear favorite, really, in the NFC South. I know the Bucs won it last year, and they're probably going to contend again this year, but they've got some turnover they're dealing with, too, especially at the offensive coordinator. The Falcons really are set up right to get this done this time around, right? There's no questions about their quarterback situation. Everyone's going to make it out like there's a question between Cousins and Penix, but I think we all know the plan is now to start Cousins for 2 years, or unless something falters, and then turn it over to Penix, and you've got this smooth transition, right? It was the entire idea behind drafting Michael Penix. But, no, they've got enough balance and that you would think, even defensively, that they would contend. They should be the favorite for this division.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get on to the next team in a second, but the season's just around the corner, which means it's fantasy season right now. We have the last couple of spaces in the PFF NFL Podcast Fantasy League up for grabs. The Big Goofy division is already stuffed full. The Grumpy division is already stuffed full, which means the late division still has a couple of spots left to fill. Go to the PFF Discord. You can find the link in the description. Grab those last couple of spots and let's fill this league. But way more importantly, it's also discount time for PFF Plus. You can get access to the suite of fantasy tools and rankings and all those good things for 25% off right now if you use the code NFL Show 25. NFL Show 25. That shows the good people at management at PFF. That shows that we sent you, right? That's the most important thing here. That Steve, Sam, Trevor, Dalton, we are the guys that sent you to the discount. That gets you 25% off. What does it get you 25% off? Well, this is from the great Nathan Yankee himself. First and foremost, my rankings. which are amongst the most accurate in the business. I believe, based on Fantasy Pros accuracy, he's been the most accurate ranker out there for the last 70 weeks, something like that. Nathan Yankee is as good as it gets with his ranking based off all of the PFF data and information. It also gets you access to the Fantasy Mock Draft Sim. If you are into the Mock Draft Sim generally, the real one, during draft time where you can do all the mock drafts to your heart's content, the Fantasy Mock Draft Simulator lets you import your league, practice your draft with realistic settings before having your real one. Play through all of the scenarios that you could possibly think of, just like real NFL teams. If you watched the Hard Knocks offseason with the New York Giants, you saw them basically playing through mock draft sims and still didn't get it right because nobody saw the Michael Penix Jr. pick coming. Anywho, get yourself in on all the good stuff. NFL Show 25 will get you 25% off your PFF Plus subscription this fantasy season. On behalf of Nathan Yankee, you are welcome. All right, next team. Let's go to the Carolina Panthers. And not just because I recently saw a video of Bryce Young arriving for training camp looking like a middle schooler. But where do we expect the Panthers to go now that they have freed Bryce Young of everything that was dragging him down last season and instead replaced him with new head coach Dave Canales and everything else?
I'm really optimistic about this, honestly. Outside of
Dalton's
Jim Harbaugh, who is an obvious...
What happened?
Who's an obvious... Are we good?
I'm getting nothing. Oh, no. My battery died.
Oh, that's what
exactly
it is.
what.
Okay.
Carry on talking, Dalton, while they replace my battery so I can hear things.
Anyway, outside of Jim Harbaugh, who's obviously his own tier of hire, Dave Canales for me was my favorite hire, other than that of any of these new coaches. I thought he did an absolutely spectacular job calling plays and really working with what was a flawed team, right? The Buccaneers were the lowest graded team to make the postseason last year, and dealing with a quarterback who was really trying to revamp his career, an offense that struggled the year before, even with Tom Brady, and really a bad interior offensive line that struggled to run the ball and create lanes. Canales did an unbelievable job creating this modern ball control offense, heavy RPO, sort of thing. And I think he can bring that same element to the Panthers. And he came in here. Couple of things I love that he did. He kept Ejiro Evero around as his defensive coordinator because the Panthers don't have a bad defense. And I know they traded Brian Burns, but they still have, when healthy, a pretty good defense, right? Guys like Derek Brown and Shaq Thompson, they brought in Josie Jewell. J.C. Horn is really, really good, makes a huge difference in coverage when he's healthy. And to me, fixing the interior of this offensive line is massive, right? Last year, they had the second worst interior offensive line in the league. Bryce Young pressured on over 40% of his dropbacks. And you bring in Robert Hunt, who is the sixth highest graded guard in the league last year. Damian Lewis, who is another solid guard. He has been for 4 years in Seattle. And they get their starting center, Austin Corbett, back, who just dealt with injuries all last year, had a solid 2022, and I think only played like 4 or 5 games last year and was a lot better when he's healthy, right? So I think the improvement, especially for a guy like you mentioned, like Bryce Young, who's 5'8", 5'9", interior pass protection is an absolute must. And I think the combination of them improving that and Canales' play calling and a really good group of rookies and additions they made with the weaponry, I'm really optimistic about this Panthers situation. Obviously, we need to see Bryce Young play better, but the conditions, much like Trevor Lawrence his first year with the Jaguars, the conditions could not have been any worse. Honestly, I think if you're judging Bryce Young off of 2024, you're doing it a little 2023, I should say, you're doing it a little prematurely.
Yeah, there's no way of not being a little bit worried by what we saw from Bryce Young last year. But it is reasonable and accurate to point out that everything around him was terrible. I mean, that was a new regime where people got fired at the end of it because it was so bad, right? It was legitimately a disaster. The receiving core was clearly a problem from day one. On paper heading into the year, that looked like a concern. That was the sort of the cost almost of going to get a guy like Bryce Young, as you had to give up DJ Moore to make it happen. So receiving was always going to be a problem. The offensive line, I don't think should have been as bad as it was last year, but was terrible, and that was a major issue. And then the scheme, this kind of weird, disparate collection of coaches just didn't gel together and didn't function as a cohesive unit. So the scheme, I don't think, was helping him out either. Now, theoretically, this offseason, all of those things got improved, right? Those are the kind of 3 pillars of a quarterback support system. The receiving core has been upgraded and updated. You've got Deontay Johnson, who comes in who can definitely get separation, right? That's the biggest problem from last year's group. Adam Thielen is still there. Deontay Johnson comes in to definitely add some separation to the table. And then in the draft, they bring in Xavier Legette, this giant contested catch monster who's also got blazing speed. And maybe he's going to be, I don't want to say a one-dimensional receiver, but not the most complete receiver in the world. But the things that he does well should absolutely play from day one. The offensive line, as you talked about, got upgraded. And then the scheme should be simplified, should be streamlined, and has got an immediate, recent, proven track record of succeeding with quarterbacks that had struggles before that. Baker Mayfield, Geno Smith, et cetera. So, and they even upgraded the backfield. Jonathan Brooks coming in as well, albeit coming off his ACL injury. But theoretically, everything around Bryce Young is better now. And now we should get a better idea of what Bryce Young himself can do. And, I feel like his size stuff, obviously it's just funny seeing him walk around next to like NFL-sized people, and it just looks comic. But I feel like when things are going badly, it's easy to kind of focus on that and be like, he's way too small to succeed at the NFL. It's just never going to work. You can't put a guy that size, on an NFL field. It's a disaster. But I don't know if I don't think size was a problem last year for him. I don't think his failures were because he was small. It was just everything went bad. And if things start going well, I don't think we'll be focusing on his size. It's just he's going to be a small quarterback. The problems were not physical, I think, for Bryce Young last season.
Yeah, no, for sure. And obviously the coaching situation, like you mentioned, wasn't ideal. But I don't care if he was 6'5" and 240. He was not going to succeed with that supporting cast that he had. Again, the interior offensive line was a mess. Adam Thielen was by far their best receiver, and I don't know that was the plan going into the year. And Miles Sanders just busted at running back complete. By the end of the year, Chuba Hubbard was just the starter, right? So,
right.
Now you've got Hubbard and Brooks. And I think, honestly, the guy you mentioned that I wanted to bring up was Legette, because you've got a team really, and I know Bryce Young isn't going to have the biggest arm in the league. He's not a Josh Allen or Herbert or Mahomes, right? But you still have to be able to work the ball downfield, right? And the Panthers had the lowest receiving grade in the NFL on 10-plus yard targets, right? And Young, he had a below-average passing grade on those throws, but it certainly wasn't the worst, right? I think it was around somewhere between 20th and 22nd in there. It was not great because he didn't have a whole lot to work with, but when he took shots downfield, he was making a decent amount of the throws, and his receivers were not hauling him in. Xavier Legette was the highest-graded receiver in the country last season on 10-plus yard targets, higher than Harrison, higher than Neighbors, Odunze, Worthy, whoever. He was number one. So when you talk about a guy, even if he doesn't get a high volume of catches, the more I watched him, the more I thought about DK Metcalf, right? When he came out, he was this physical freak. He just looked like a different animal out there, not the most nuanced route runner, but between taking the top off the defense for the rest of his receivers, right? They should have other guys that can work underneath. Johnson and Thielen and even Jonathan Mingo. And, I think their fourth-round pick, Jatavion Sanders, could be starting at tight end very, very soon. You talk about the decoy factor, and then there's going to be times, when you look at Dave Canales' offense and what he did with, say, a Mike Evans last year, the skinny post and things like that coming off of the play action, coming off of the RPOs were just perfect. He just timed it up perfectly, and it was the right receiver when you talk about a Mike Evans, running those sorts of routes and making plays downfield. Legette's not as tall as Evans, but he can absolutely fly, man. He can do exactly what a Mike Evans or a DK Metcalf can do in that offense. I'm looking at Legette to really open things up for Young and create all that space that, one, he can throw it down the field and be more efficient, and two, open up space for all those new weapons you're talking about underneath.
Yeah, I do expect Carolina to take a significant step forward, a jump forward, really, from last year. I don't know if it's going to be enough to contend, in that division that we just said Atlanta is the favorite for. Tampa Bay should be fine still, even with Canales leaving. The Saints, I think, are probably going to be better than they were a year ago because Derek Carr started to get it together late in the year. And if they get that version of Carr for the entire season, they're probably the team that may be pushing to win that division. Carolina, I think, is probably still team 4 in this division. But now at least things are on the right track for them, theoretically. And if Bryce Young starts to show why he was the number 1 overall pick, and now that we mentioned Bryce Young, it's queuing up Eli to show the video of him arriving at training camp looking like a middle schooler arriving for his first day. There's no way of getting around it, right? It looks ridiculous. He's tiny. The funny thing is, though, like, he's not actually tiny, right? He's my size, right? He's normal size human. It's just that you see, remember, like, every time the Olympics comes around, the Olympics is coming around now, and every now and then there's a tweet that surfaces that's like, every single Olympic event should have a regular person running it at the same time, just for context. Bryce Young is the regular human in a world where everybody is 6'5", 250, right? Like, he's just a regular sized person for context at all times. That's what he is. But he's not actually tiny. Like, he is, I believe his measurement of 5'10", I don't believe is 204 pounds. I think he's like 180, 185. But if he's 5'10", 185, he's my size. That's what a normal sized human being looks like out on an NFL field.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe that's what he is. He's the people's quarterback, right, Sam? It's just he can represent. I think it felt like for a while we had a few guys like that. Well, even Doug Flutie back in the day, right, was one of those guys, or even, to an extent, Drew Brees. I mean, Drew Brees was a freak of nature even at his size, but even him, he was about 6 foot and maybe 210. Like, you've got some of these guys. But again, that's what they always talked about with Bryce Young in Alabama. They're like, don't look at that. It's from the neck up where he's elite and he can make plays and he's just got, high-level instincts. Maybe he'll be protected long enough where we get to see that this year. But it is a fun visual, especially getting to see him behind these big offensive. Like, think about standing next to a guy like Robert Hunt, and then you see Bryce Young. It's a funny visual for sure. But I mean, look, he was the number one pick for a reason, though, even despite that. So I think they should still, if they support him right, and if Canales, I'll tell you what, if Canales calls plays like he did last year, he's got maybe that's his new nickname. He's just the people's quarterback is what it should be.
I want to see the first image of Bryce Young and Xavier Legette celebrating. I feel like that's the Derrick Henry, Mark Ingram picture that we need. Like, there's going to be a photo of those two handshaking or whatever. It's going to look absolutely insane. All right, that's Carolina out of the way. What about the Los Angeles Chargers, the Jim Harbaugh-led Los Angeles Chargers? What do we expect from them?
This one, you just feel like, I mean, obviously Jim Harbaugh's a great coach, but more than anything, they needed the culture shock, right? Like, we need a winner in here. And we had too many times where we had all this talent and we're just losing close games and we're just not playing fundamentally sound football. And these are things that Jim Harbaugh teams do, right? Like, since 2009, whether it be NFL or college, his only losing season was the COVID year in 2020 at Michigan. He went 2-4. So you're talking about a guy who's a proven winner, and we see the Chargers getting dark horse wild card hype because Jim Harbaugh just doesn't lose. Even his worst teams at Michigan or at the very end with the 49ers were like average teams that were still really, really competitive, right? I mean, and the hallmarks are just they play fundamentally sound football. They play really physical football, especially on defense, and they run the ball. And that last part is where the Chargers, they've made it very clear that they're going to come in here and they're going to run the football more than the Chargers did before, right? You've got Harbaugh in there, Greg Roman back as his offensive coordinator, and you've got a team last year that was last in rushing grade and run blocking grade. So what does he go and do? Draft Joe Alt and pick up every Ravens running back that exists to come with Greg Roman. This is going to look different. Now, I can't say that necessarily they're going to make the postseason because they were in such a hole last year. I mean, they were just, giving up 63 points to the Raiders and things like that. Their defense has kind of been a mess for a couple of years. But you can guarantee, at the very least, that same crew is going to go in there under Harbaugh, and they're going to play more physical and more fundamentally sound football. Now, with Justin Herbert at quarterback, and you still have some stars on defense, right? Mack and Bosa and James and Gilman. And, this is a team that does not have the talent level of a 5-win team. There's certain sore spots, right? D-tackle, maybe linebacker, receiver they're working on. But they're just going to play better. It's going to look cleaner than it has under the last few coaches. As far as the number of wins, I think that's hard to predict because the Harbaugh and Justin Herbert factor is one of the biggest X factors, I think, in the entire league right now. We've seen how good Justin Herbert can be. We've seen how good Jim Harbaugh can be, just won a national title. The two of them together is a really, really interesting dynamic. But all around them, they're going to play better football. That's almost unquestioned.
Yeah, I think that's the Harbaugh one is interesting because I think almost everybody expects him to succeed. I don't know that there's that many people out there who believe there's no way the Harbaugh thing works. It's, destined for failure. It's like it's going to work. The question is how quickly is it going to work, right? And, how quickly can they transform the version of the team that's been into this sort of Harbaugh brand of hard-nosed, run power type of offense, and even sort of adding some teeth to that defense that's been more talent and production over the last few years. It's like, can he do that in an offseason? Like, even I watched him yesterday giving an interview about Quentin Johnston, right, who has unquestionably been a disappointment so far in the NFL. Harbaugh is talking him up acting like the question of him being a disappointment is ridiculous, right, first and foremost, and then talking about him basically being one of the best wide receivers he's ever seen, right? So big, so fast, he's gotten stronger, his body control is outstanding, reminding people that he's still bruised from what he did to them in Michigan in the semifinal game a couple of years ago. And it's like, that dude is an amazing hype man, right? Like, Quentin Johnston is being written off by most people outside of that building, and he's out there making him sound like Randy Moss heading into training camp in year 2. That has to have an impact. I mean, I started to buy into it a little bit, let alone if you're Quentin Johnston reading that, and all you've seen for the last 12 months is people dumping on you, and now here's your coach with this proven track record, and that dude is like going to bat for you in the media. This is why people love playing for Harbaugh. Like, he knows how to do that, and whether it's an act or whether he's just genuinely like that, that's why people want to play for him, and that works. Like, it motivates people.
Yeah, and look, I think he is genuinely like that, right? When you think about, I can remember going all the way back when the Niners drafted Colin Kaepernick, and I was early in the second round, and Jim Harbaugh said, "Oh no, I just drafted the best football player in this draft," and that felt a little exaggerated, but then you see him get 5 yards from a Super Bowl trophy, and you're like, man, like, was he right? Or even at Michigan, look, Michigan isn't loaded. They're not loaded with 5-star talent and these big number 1 recruiting classes and all that. Jim Harbaugh is all about player development, right? And that's what this really, on top of changing the culture, right? That's the first thing he's talking about getting in the brooms and sweeping the weight room himself and getting the dirty work done is he's all about player development. A guy like Quentin Johnston, look, he's got to hype him up. He knows the talent. Quentin Johnston torched him in the playoff game 2 years ago, right? He took a shallow route, 75 yards on him, and TCU beat them. He knows physically what he can do. It's just about player development now. And you could argue we haven't seen that enough from the Chargers in recent years with some of their early draft picks, right? Harbaugh he believes in every guy on the team having a role. He believes in having balance, and he believes in developing what he has in there. And like you said, it might not be this season, right? And who knows if he'll ever win a Super Bowl, right? Maybe that first time around with San Francisco is as close as he'll ever get. But that's what he's going to do. All that positivity, all of that stuff, that just comes with Jim Harbaugh, and that's part of the Jim Harbaugh culture, right? And people doubted it at Michigan, and eventually he made it work, right? People, the 49ers, remember before he got there, they were a mess. They were changing offensive coordinators every year. Alex Smith was a bust, and everything was going wrong. And he comes in there, and boom, the culture just changes. And if there was any team in the league that needed that sort of culture shock, it's them. I mean, everything that they need. Culture shock, get more physical, play more fundamentally sound, and honestly, just late game scenarios, man. Situational football. Jim Harbaugh's got all of it, right? Again, don't know how soon. But they have Justin Herbert and they have Jim Harbaugh, and he's going to find some way to some extent to make that work. I think that's why teams want to play for him, is because all of that positivity, all that bluster is genuine coming from him.
So let's put a number on it. They won 5 games a year ago. Harbaugh comes in. The division, obviously it's tough because you got Kansas City in it, but Denver, the Raiders, like neither one of those teams necessarily are going to be amazing this year. How many games do we think that the Chargers are going to win?
I think 8 or 9 wins is really realistic. I think just by playing better situational football, they could get to 8 wins. I mean, and you saw games late in the year, probably the last 4 or 5 games, especially when they got whacked by the Raiders, they were pretty much just quitting, right? And I think they even lost to the Chiefs with Chad Henne playing quarterback, right? So it's they were late in the year. It's hard to look at their record and go, okay, they didn't just quit on the last 4 or 5 games. But no, I think 8 or 9 is really realistic. I probably wouldn't pick them to take a playoff spot, but they're not going to be that far from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Like, I think there will be an immediate jump because of the Harbaugh thing. Like, I don't think he's going to propel them into contention right away, even with a guy like Justin Herbert giving them that ceiling theoretically. But I do think that stuff we talked about with Quentin Johnston and like Harbaugh's attitude and siege mentality and rah-rah ability, I do think that's going to work. And I definitely think, I think they immediately go from 5 wins to one of those teams in and around that 500 chase. Obviously, you can't hit 500 anymore, but that, the 8.5 type, I think 8.5 is their win total. Like, they're projected, the Vegas line right now with DraftKings or whatever. So I think they're in and around that area of, 8 wins, 9 wins. I think that's definitely a realistic target for this team because, you can't forget that they have a guy as good as Justin Herbert. That gives them such an ability. If they can create a team around him that's a little bit more like those sort of Seahawks teams with Russell Wilson, Herbert could absolutely dominate in those close situations. All right, next team up. Let's go with the Tennessee Titans. I guess a surprise new coach team because they had Mike Vrabel. I don't think many people expected them to get rid of Mike Vrabel off the back of last season, but they did, and they bring in Brian Callahan, and then they set to work. They've done a lot to this team in the offseason. So what do we expect from the Titans?
Yeah, this is the hardest situation to read because you look at a lot of the names they picked up, and they're really productive players, right? When you look at Tony Pollard, Calvin Ridley, Lloyd Cushenberry at center, right? L'Jarius Sneed in the trade with the Chiefs, and you go, they should be better, but I have a hard time getting a read on, what are they great at, right? Especially with Derrick Henry gone now, who is still by far their best player. I'm curious what the identity of this team is because they have more talent than you would think for a team that I think a lot of people are going to expect to be in last place. I think this year really is about developing some young players that they drafted this year, especially this offensive line, right? J.C. Latham and then another year of Peter Skoronski. But it's really going to be about finding out if Will Levis is that guy, right? You spent the first pick of the second round on him. Last year he showed you some good things and he showed you some kind of unstable things. He's got this kind of tendency to be a high variance playmaker, and it's kind of the same way he was at Kentucky, right? Where there's some big plays and then you go through stretches where there's some not great plays and his accuracy and stuff like that. I think that's what this year is about more than wins and losses for Tennessee. Is Will Levis going to be our guy, or can we go into next year's draft looking at a Carson Beck, a Shedeur Sanders, a Connor Wegman, something like that? You need that defined answer at quarterback. And I think of all the teams on this, that we're talking about today, they're one of two that really doesn't have that right now. The Titans, I think they're weird because I think they're not going to win a ton of games, but I think they're going to be in a lot of games just because of the talent they have, right? They have some sort of talent at almost every spot on their roster, plus talent, right? Calvin Ridley might not be Tyreek Hill or Justin Jefferson, but he's pretty darn good, right? And they still have DeAndre Hopkins, and they still, Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears is a really good pair in the backfield. There are things to work with, but is it enough to get him over the hump to win a lot of games?
It's such an unusual approach to the kind of surrounding the quarterback with talent because most teams, when they do that, don't go for these sort of, their receiving core in particular. The offensive line is a different issue. The backfield is maybe a different issue. But the receiving core that they've assembled is, it has a very short shelf life, potentially. DeAndre Hopkins still showed last year that he's a really high-end receiver still. Maybe he's not the complete total receiver that he used to be. He can't really take the top off of defense anymore, or at least scare teams deep, even if he'll still make some deep catches, with a well-thrown pass. But he's still really good. Calvin Ridley is a good route runner. Showed last year that he has some limitations as well. But again, not the youngest receiver out there. Tyler Boyd is coming off, a down year for him and has been in the league for a while. This is a pretty short-term fix for a receiving core that you're giving to this quarterback who may be who's going into his first year starting and, maybe the sort of first year of his starting career, however long that lasts. You don't usually see that. You tend to find teams pair these guys with younger stars that are going to be there for a while. But it should be good right away. It's a group that maybe isn't going to last that long, but talent-wise, it's got a lot of ability. The offensive line, I think, has the capacity, though, to be the single biggest needle mover for this team. Okay, you got rid of Derrick Henry. That may not have been a plus move, but Tyjae Spears showed last season he's really, really good. And if he gets the Zeke Elliott workload to Tony Pollard's change of pace type, I think that would make some sense. That offensive line, though, with Bill Callahan coming over as well as the offensive line coach, that group could take a huge jump forward. You've got what was the worst offensive line in football for 2 straight years. Now you've got a rookie top draft pick in J.C. Latham at left tackle. You've got Peter Skoronski at left guard, who didn't have a great season last year, but also dealt with an appendectomy that, lost weight, lost strength, basically forced him to take a step backwards in a bad time where there's no way of clawing that back. So he should be better this year. Lloyd Cushenberry, slow start to his NFL career, but he's become a really good center. Daniel Brunskill, and then the sort of question mark of Nicholas Petit-Frere or Jalen Duncan or whoever it's going to be at right tackle. Even if that one spot, right tackle, is a disaster, potentially that's 4 out of 5 spots are in pretty good shape, which is a huge leap forward from the last 2 years where they've had maybe 1 out of 5 spots in good shape. That could completely transform the entire offense and just gives Will Levis such a better platform to operate from.
Yeah, I think for as much as Hopkins and Ridley are the big names of the offense, the key to it is going to be having balance and being able to run behind that line with Pollard and Spears, right? We've seen Tony Pollard put up big-time production and big-time grading with Dallas, and Tyjae Spears is a solid back too, right? And he can catch a lot and do a bunch of different things. That's going to be the key, though, is getting, I think, Will Levis in as many play-action situations as possible. When you look at what he used to do back in Kentucky or when he was successful last year, he's the quarterback that you want taking play-action shots down the field, right? If they can work Calvin Ridley downfield as a deep threat off of it's hard to tell what sort of run schemes they're going to use because the Bengals were kind of multiple. It depended, there's some game plan stuff that went into that when Callahan was there. But I think that's where you want Will Levis. Let's draw these safeties in. Let's run the ball. Let's be physical with J.C. Latham in this offensive line, and then we'll let Levis use the cannon over the top, right? Because he can make any throw on the field. That's clear. And even getting him out on the move and bootlegs and stuff. We know Will Levis has a strong arm, and we know he can run the ball. There's a lot of the in-between stuff that is a question mark still, right? But I think to use his skill set and optimize his skill set, play action is going to be the big thing in this offense. If they can get the run game going with Pollard and Spears and they get to a lot of their play action game, I think Levis could have a lot of success. This is not a team to me that wants to fall behind and get away from that. I don't know that Levis is ready to drop back and throw it 40 times in straight drop back situations every week, but there's a formula here where they can win games. It's just that, like you said, between the offensive line and then just what we think Will Levis can do right now, you're kind of threading the needle when it comes to getting all of that done.
Yeah, the Levis evaluation, I think, is difficult because everyone sort of focuses on, 4 touchdowns in his debut for the rest of the season and the kind of crazy element that he brought to the table with just recklessness with his own body. I feel like, though, his situation doesn't get as much attention as Bryce Young, say, in Carolina, where everything was obviously terrible. Levis's was different because the receiving, he had Nuke Hopkins, he had some weapons to work with, but I don't think we kind of appropriately weigh just how bad that offensive line was. He was working behind an offensive line that was bad enough that you don't get a fair evaluation of Will Levis. You can look at his sack rate and all these kinds of things. We are not getting a fair interpretation of how Will Levis plays the game based off how bad that offensive line was. So for the Titans to come in this offseason and theoretically fix that, then do what they've done in terms of the additions at receiving core, I mean, at very minimum, however good or bad they're going to be this year, we should be getting a fair eval of Will Levis now. He now has a situation that looks good, looks completely tenable, looks able for him to show what he can do, and then we get to have an idea of what exactly that is. I think their defense is in reasonable shape as well. I mean, I expect the Titans to be a pretty decent team this year, with obviously the massive variable being just how good is Will Levis.
Yeah, I agree. I think 6-7 wins probably sounds about right to me when you just look at their talent across the board. But that's what it's about, right? If Will Levis does hit, and even if you only still win, let's say even 6 or 7 games, but he does play better and you feel like this is a guy you can work with for another year, then you talk about going and getting a younger weapon in next year's draft. Let's say you're still picking between 8 and 12, a Luther Burden or a Tetsuo McMillan or a Travis Hunter or something like that in next year's draft. Now you talk about, okay, we can start to transition. We focus on Levis. We get younger primetime weapons in here. that it's going to be the big question, really. I think this season for Tennessee, unless they really surprise some people, it's not going to be about the win-loss record. It's going to be about, is Will Levis the guy? And do we surround him, or do we take a new quarterback and surround that guy and figure it out from there and kind of do this again next year with a rookie and go, okay, what does this kid need to succeed, right? That's really what this is about. I think there's a lot of intangible when you talk about having to overhaul. The Titans were kind of hanging on to the old regime there, the teams that were making the playoffs, and even Derrick Henry was kind of the last piece of that. They need to find out if Levis is that guy so they just know the plan and the vision going forward.
All right, 3 more teams to get to. The Washington Commanders, they go for kind of a retread head coach in Dan Quinn coming in, fresh off his success with the Dallas Cowboys defense. Massive changes in Washington top to bottom. Huge proportion of that roster overhauled. Obviously a new quarterback as well, Jaden Daniels at the top of the draft. What do we expect from Washington?
I expect, and I'll tell you what, I was kind of waiting to see if they would maybe still trade for Brandon Ayuk and see where that goes. But we're not sure if that's going to happen. But either way, I expect improvement. I think Dan Quinn can come in there and change things quick. And for me, this was a monster draft class. This was actually my favorite draft class in the whole league. When you talk about everything they brought in with Daniels, Johnny Newton, Mike Sainristil, Luke McCaffrey, Ben Sinnott, like there's just players all over the place who are really good college players. But for me, it's all about Daniels. There's probably nobody in our building that hypes up Jaden Daniels more than I do. And you look at last year, he had the first normal offseason of his entire college career. There was turmoil at Arizona State. There was COVID. There was transferring to LSU. And then finally in the 2023 offseason, just a normal offseason where you can get better and practice and get in spring ball and do all the normal things that college quarterbacks do. And immediately he was the best offensive player in the country. And people think that this was, some one-year wonder breakout, like he was awful for 4 years. That was not the case. He was good at Arizona State, and everything fell apart around him. The first year at LSU, he needed about a month to get used to the SEC, and then he started teeing off. He's really, I look at him and I go, that could be, and down the line, an MVP caliber player. Because you talk about the dual threat and everything he brings with the speed and his feet. He added the big-time throws in last year in the Heisman campaign, and he has the best turnover-worthy play rate of any FBS quarterback we've recorded with at least 600 dropbacks in his career, since 10 years of doing this. So he, to me, is the full package. If Caleb wasn't sitting there, he would have been the number 1 pick pretty easily. I think you just look at the season he's coming off of, and everybody goes, well, why didn't he win? And they had 3 losses, and, their defense gave up 142 points in their 3 losses. So even their losses, he was scoring 40-plus, and he just couldn't overcome what was wrong with LSU's defense. But I think Jaden Daniels is something to really, really be excited about in Washington. I'm excited to watch him. I think he's spectacular. I think he's every bit as in the Rookie of the Year race as Caleb Williams or anybody else is. I really do. And this is not a bad group of weapons he's working with when you have Robinson, Eckler, McLaurin, Zach Ertz and Ben Sinnott at tight end, Jahan Dotson still finding his way. I could use one more weapon. I'll be honest with you, Sam. If they were to trade for Brandon Ayuk, I might pick him to get a wild card spot. I think they can turn this around that quick with Daniels and with Dan Quinn at the helm.
Yeah, I find Washington a really difficult team to project forward because, number one, I don't think they were necessarily as bad as a 4-13 record last season. But number two, they changed so much. Like, new quarterback, just a massive turnover of that entire roster. They're in that weird division where things seem to change year to year. Like, no team has won that division 2 straight years for years now. They have such a broad range of outcomes, I think, because of just the sheer volume of change there. But overall, I think you're right that Jaden Daniels could be really, really good. Their offensive line is still a bit of a concern to me. They don't have a great looking one on paper. It's kind of like the Buffalo Bills offensive line, where I think generally speaking, there's not a lot of investment in it. It's a level that average is probably the default outcome for all 5 starters. But there's also a world where you get the low end of those outcomes for all 5 guys, and now you have a problematic offensive line for a year. So that could potentially put a cap on how good they can be right away. But the group definitely looks like a unit that could make noise on both sides of the ball. And, okay, I don't think that they'll be where the Cowboys or the Eagles are, but I think this could be a close division, maybe tighter than people are expecting it to be.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, again, it's all about Daniels and how he can get into this offense. Now, I do think, as far as the offensive line concerned, I do think Daniels' mobility itself helps that. And I think Cliff Kingsbury kind of has a reputation for getting the ball out quickly, especially out to the perimeter. So there's some things in there that I think they can work around it. I don't think it's the worst line in the league. It could certainly be a concern, and offensive tackle especially is a spot where that could be a sore spot. But I look at them more, and the concerns for me are more on defense. I mean, they gave up the most points in football last year by far. They looked out of sync. Now, you've obviously got Dan Quinn, who's basically changing the entire defense around schematically from what it used to be. But there's some things there. Now, I love what they added, especially at linebacker. You get Bobby Wagner and Frankie Louvu in there at linebacker, your defense is going to get better, right? The two spots for me that I'd be concerned about are off the edge. Obviously, last year they traded Montez Sweat and Chase Young. And the one concerning thing, when I watched Emmanuel Forbes last year, that was another guy I was a little concerned with, like how that first year went. But maybe in a new defense, in a Dan Quinn defense, it fits his skill set a little better, and we can get rolling. I think, look, there are flaws on this team, on both sides of the ball for sure. But I think, again, look, Dan Quinn, we forget, Dan Quinn's a really good coach. He was up 28-3 in a Super Bowl, and I won't go any further than that for you people in Atlanta. But I just think this was probably the right guy in this moment to bring kind of like Harbaugh to maybe a little lesser extent, to bring a winning culture back in here. Quinn obviously did a great job in Dallas the last 3 years. And then I just think there's just an infusion of talent that I don't think is normal to have in all of this talent come in here in one off season. Like, especially if the two guys on defense who hit in the draft, Johnny Newton and Mike Sainristil, if they hit on those two guys, you've got a seriously better base to work with over there now, along with the new linebackers. They need a guy like Dorrance Armstrong, who came over with Quinn from Dallas. There's a lot of talent. There's a lot more talent on this team than there was last year.
Yeah, Forbes might be a great example or a great case study for the sort of difference in coaching between last year and this year. Last year, Forbes is another one of these guys with a fake weight, right? Whatever he's listed as, like 185 or something, it's not. It's 170 max, right? So you've got this guy who's 170 pounds, lightweight, long, so it's not like he's 5'10", 170. He's like, whatever he is, 6'1", 6'2", 170. He's a tall, long corner who's incredibly skinny and lightweight. Just look at pictures of the guy at training camp. There's nothing to him. And he's being told to go out there and cover A.J. Brown for an entire game, right? A guy who outweighs him by a minimum of 50 pounds, right? That's just not setting the kid up for success. Meanwhile, Dan Quinn, like one of the characteristics of his defense in Dallas was he's going to change things to put players in the right position. Like, oh, you're not great at this, but you're amazing at this? Fine, let's do more of that. Like, Micah Parsons was drafted as a linebacker and became an edge rusher because Dan Quinn looked at this and said, dude, this guy's Lawrence Taylor out here. Forget the linebacker thing. Go do that more. Like, that's amazing. Same thing with Trayvon Diggs, with the corners he had. Like, Dan Quinn has shown he wants to put players in a position to succeed. The previous regime immediately set up Forbes for failure. So I agree with you. Year one, concerning for Forbes, was not good. I do, however, think that they just hired like the perfect coach to at least put him in the right positions, and then we'll see if he can make that work going forward. Two remaining teams. Seattle Seahawks. Another, like this time, long-term head coach let go. Pete Carroll, the incredible regime, the incredible tenure that he had with the Seahawks, gone. We bring in a new head coach, this time from Baltimore, Mike McDonald. What do we expect from the Seahawks?
I would expect, there's been a lot of talk in the NFC about the NFC North and Caleb Williams, and then you go out east and Jaden Daniels, and the Rams are still good, and the Cardinals are coming with Kyler and Marvin Harrison. But Seattle's kind of this forgotten team in the NFC that should still be in playoff contention, right? They've gone 9-8 the last 2 years, made the playoffs in 22, just missed it last year. A lot of problems in the trenches, but I think what Mike McDonald is going to want to bring is just a more physical football team to the field. Out on the perimeter, Seattle's really, really good. Obviously, Geno Smith has had a resurgence in his career. They're really good at receiver. They're really good in the secondary. They got a good set of backs, right? But What needs to be improved here is in the trenches and their ability to run and stop the run, right? And you look down the stretch last year, those are the two things that let them down, right? They were 25th in the second half of the year in yards per carry, and they were dead last in yards per carry allowed in that stretch. And I think Mike Macdonald is going to want to fix this front seven. And the offensive line is going to be a harder task. We'll get there. But I think fixing their run defense is going to be huge. And obviously you lose Bobby Wagner, who's like the franchise stalwart. He was the only one carrying their run defense. They just needed more depth. They needed to get more well-rounded. So you let Wagner walk. And I think with McDonald, for me, I focus on linebackers for him, because you look at the Ravens with Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. Second they got together, they were like the best pair of linebackers in football. So for a year and a half. Now he's trying to build that out with the same thing. A guy with a lot of potential is Terrell Dodson, who they're bringing in from Buffalo, who was the highest graded linebacker in football last year. And he was essentially in a huge pressure spot, replacing Matt Milano, who tore his ACL and was done for the year very, very early and played really well. And then he brought in Jerome Baker from Miami, I believe, as well. This is a guy who wants to come in here. Look, he's been with the Harbaughs for a long time. They play a physical brand of football. That's what he's going to want on both sides of the ball, and that's what Seattle needs, and that's what I expect.
Yeah, I think the Seattle actually, this is a really good roster with one potential Achilles heel, and it's that offensive line, right? Now, at PFF's offensive line rankings, they came in 31st out of 32 teams in the NFL, so it's a big concern. And, okay, in the draft, everyone was predicting them to take an interior offensive lineman, with their first-round pick. So acute was that need. And instead, they're like, no, we don't like taking those guys high. We don't think it's worth it. They had the patience. They waited it out. And they got a guy like Christian Haynes, great value pick, potentially a great pick up for them just to improve that group. But you look at the starting five, what it's going to be. Charles Cross, I think, has become a good left tackle already, and who knows how much better he can get. One spot is in good shape, and it is the most valuable spot still, left tackle. So, cool, that's fine. Laken Tomlinson, former first-round pick, but has basically only been good in Shanahan offenses, right? That witchcraft that the Shanahan system is able to produce for offensive linemen and protecting them, it works great. It worked on Laken Tomlinson, but any other system, he's been a below-average offensive lineman. Center, whether it's Oluwatimi, whether it's Nick Harris, center looks like a below-average starter right now. Right guard, they basically need Christian Haynes to come in and be a starter right away and be good. Otherwise, that's a problem spot. And then right tackle, Abraham Lucas, the third-round pick in the same year as Charles Cross, looked like a really good player right out of the gate, but I don't think has gotten better. In fact, if anything, I think it's slid backwards a little bit. So he might be an average or below average starter as well. And maybe you can, offset that or mitigate that with George Fant as a backup. But potentially that's at least 3 spots, maybe 4 out of your 5 offensive line positions are in trouble. So, Geno Smith throwing to those great receivers, Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet in the backfield, everything other than those offensive linemen look great. But that can undermine the whole thing. Everything gets harder if that group is the 31st best team in the NFL. That's my concern for the Seahawks. I think the defense is in good shape. I think everything other than the offensive line on the offensive side is in good shape. But that whole unit could undermine everything.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's hard not to agree with that. The 2 big things that they need, Abraham Lucas dealt with a lot of injuries last year. He basically never played 100%. So I think there is a bounce back possibility there for Lucas at right tackle. And I'm with you. I would start Christian Haynes right away. I think athletically he's good enough to start in the NFL right away. Not the strongest dude in the world, but I think they're going to run a good amount of that zone scheme in this offense under Ryan Grubb, and Haynes is just a really, really good fit for that. And he's an awesome pass protector, too. I know people are going to say, well, he came from UConn. But when they played even Power 5 teams, Christian Haynes held up really well in pass protection. I would start him right away at right guard. And Lucas's health, I think, is the biggest X factor. Because if those 2 things hit and you maybe have 2 soft spots on your offensive line, there's a lot of teams with 2 soft spots on their offensive line. Honestly, the Chiefs just won a Super Bowl with 2 soft spots up front. So, 2 is manageable, 4 is obviously not. Those 2 guys on the right side are going to be a huge key, and the pass protection is going to be a massive key, because I love Geno Smith's fit with Ryan Grubb as the offensive coordinator, and Grubb only has to go 6 miles down the road from Husky Stadium down to Lumen Field now in Seattle. Washington the last 2 years, they threw the deep ball more and better than anybody in the country. And obviously, if you have Michael Penix and that loaded group of receivers, you're going to do it. But there's a similar dynamic here. And over the last 2 years, Geno's been the highest graded deep thrower in the NFL. It's really the thing that's made their offense go. And a perfect 99.9 passing grade on 20-plus yard targets, 58 big-time throws, I believe is second behind Josh Allen. This is a team that wants to get vertical. Obviously, with Metcalf, I think Smith and Jigba, I don't think they used him completely right last year. I think he can get more vertical than you think. Tyler Lockett working underneath all of that. The run game should be good, at least for the backs. I mean, if they can block enough up front, these are two really good backs they have. But I think Ryan Grubb and Geno Smith, if they can lock down that pass protection up front, it's the one key to all of it is you do need time, right? And obviously Michael Penix at Washington had time. He had arguably the best pass protection unit in the country. The Seahawks don't have that. So how do we manage around that and still create those big plays? Because we have all the skilled players to do it.
Yeah, I think the Seahawks, it's a really tough division, so, they're different to some other teams where you're sort of saying, yeah, they're in the playoff hunt, they're in contention, they could. I mean, this is a good team. I expect them to be better than they were a year ago. I expect them to be in the mix for the playoffs, but that's a really tough ask within that division where we expect the 49ers to be probably the best team in the NFC. The Rams should be good. Even the Cardinals should be significantly better than they were a year ago. So, I think their range of outcomes in terms of actual win-loss record is pretty broad just because of how good that division is. But I do expect the Seahawks to be legit and a problem this year. And then it's just a case of does that offensive line undermine the whole thing or does it hold up? All right, last team to talk about, the New England Patriots. And obviously not just a new head coach, Gerard Mayo, the anointed one, the guy, the succession plan, the guy whose pathway to this gig was apparently codified, written in contract for when they did eventually move on from Bill Belichick. Gerard Mayo and also a new quarterback, whether it's Jacoby Brissett taking over again as an interim thing or whether they do give the job to Drake May right out of the gate. A lot of change in New England for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, you would think with kind of an incumbent going in there and replacing Belichick and you lose Steve Belichick too, who's now at the college ranks, you would think this would be an easy situation to read. And yet it feels like it isn't, right? Like we obviously haven't seen Mayo as a head coach. We don't know how they're going to handle the quarterback situation and development of Drake May. And there's a lot of mystery with the weapons. Who's going to start on the outside? Is it the two rookies? Is it still Kendrick Bourne and Demario Douglas? And even their defense. Honestly, Belichick may be the greatest defensive game planner of all time. What sort of X factor does that play? Even though they do have a talented defense, there's talent at all three levels of their defense, right? Barmore and good pair of linebackers, and Christian Gonzalez on the outside was looking like a star before he got hurt last year. But how it's the Belichick effect, right? It's kind of the opposite of getting a Jim Harbaugh or somebody in, is a Bill Belichick leaving. How much does that affect our game planning? How much does that affect our preparation and just everything that we used to do? And I'm not at all questioning Gerard Mayo's capabilities of doing that, but capability and execution are two different things, right? And you're still talking about a guy, even though he's been in the building, who's a rookie head coach. So there, to me, is as much unknown about New England as there is about any team in football. But The season is about how in the world they handle and develop Drake May. I think you mentioned it right at the top. Do you start him from day one? I would honestly, I would do it. I'm not as huge a fan as like this 6 to 7 game bridge quarterback thing as everybody else. I would just let him take the lumps and let him get the chemistry with guys in game action. I know it's a really tough division. They have a really tough schedule, but let him play. I mean, you drafted him 3rd overall for a reason. I'm in that boat. Drake May was spectacular. The last 2 years in college, he led the nation in passing grade and big-time throws. And he gives you this vertical element that New England just didn't have with Mac Jones, right? And they even drafted 2 really good vertical receivers with Jalen Polk and Javon Baker, 2 of the better vertical receivers in the country over the last couple of years. You've built this thing for Drake May. I would just let him go ahead and let it rip and make the mistakes early on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much. I have concerns about the Patriots this year. I know everyone's sort of focusing on that offensive side and saying, all right, you got the quarterback, you stayed at 3, you drafted him, but look at what's around him, whether it's the offensive line, whether it's his receiving core, even with the rookies that you're bringing in. It just doesn't look like a good situation. I might have as many questions about the defensive side as well, because you just removed the Belichicks from it, right? The highest ranking Belichicks, the ones that move the needle, theoretically, they're all gone. So we know the impact. I mean, even if you say, okay, GM Bill Belichick lost his way, even head coach Bill Belichick lost his way, the one thing that never changed was defensive coach, whether it's Bill Belichick or the Steve Belichick, the defense never lost its teeth schematically. Like, that was always able to move the needle and was always good at putting players in a position to succeed. Now that's all gone. So 20 plus years of taking these guys that were not necessarily one-dimensional, but not necessarily complete defenders, putting them in a defense, understanding what you can ask of them and what you can't, and protecting them because of that, may all have gone out of the window. And okay, Gerard Mayo, came through that system, like he's seen it operate firsthand, but we simply don't know if all of that is still going to be a thing for the Patriots, or if all of that's now off the table and this is just a regular defense. If it is, I think everything we know about the personnel on that defense changes, right? Like, everybody we think we know, all bets are off because they're completely different. Like, we've seen Jabril Peppers look horrendous in different defenses. And then he kind of resuscitates his career in New England. He starts looking like the new version of Patrick Chung. And you're like, oh, wow, Pepper, like, it's all come together. He might go back to being like the old Jabril Peppers without a Belichick defense. So, ultimately, they won, 4 games last year. I don't know that they're going to win any more than that this year, even with potentially a new quarterback. There's just so much unknown about this team now.
Yeah, I agree. And even in a broader sense than just the defense, Bill Belichick, the one thing he was better at than everybody else was just game management in general, whether it be offense or defense or just feeling out the pace of a game, right? Like, we used to see him win shootouts, or, I've seen him win games. I think a couple years ago they beat the Jets in a game 6-0 where just neither team could score, and they won on a punt return, and they basically just said, let the Jets beat themselves. Like, there are times when game management is the most premium thing in the NFL, right? We see it. Bill Belichick and Andy Reid really has won the last 2 Super Bowls because obviously he had Mahomes, but because he managed the game right? Or like, the great coaches just do that. And you see some of the not great coaches falter, not because they're terrible coaches, but because they can't manage games. And Belichick is arguably the best all time at that. We saw it all those years, a combination of him and Tom Brady. But going from the greatest game manager also of all time to a rookie head coach, no matter who it is going to be a detriment moving forward to your team. So it's really going to be this year. The concerns are right to be had because they're in a wicked tough division where any of the other 3 teams could win it, and they're all really talented. They play a wicked hard schedule otherwise, and they just don't know where this thing is going. To me, especially offensively, they're so young offensively everywhere, basically everywhere, except maybe at right tackle with Owenu and at tight end with Hunter Henry. They've got young kids all over the place, and it's going to take time, whether it's May or Brissett from the start or however they handle that part. It's still going to take a lot of time to compete in this division with so much just the youth on this football team on the field and on the sidelines.
The other thing I think that Belichick brought, so we've got the overarching ability of sort of taking potentially flawed players and minimizing those flaws, maximizing the strengths. We've got the in-game stuff you were talking about, one of the best in-game managers of all time. And then you have the third element, which is Belichick has always been outstanding at weekly game-to-game planning, right? The defense will look different versus one opponent than it will versus the next opponent, right? And that ability to change up week to week also potentially has gone out of the door now. So, it may have been the right decision to say, okay, the Belichick time, it's come to an end. It's time to mutually part ways to have this divorce. But, I mean, he is arguably the greatest head coach of all time for a reason, and the reason isn't just Tom Brady. And I think we are potentially overlooking the number of ways that can have an impact on this team in 2024 and beyond. So, there's a lot of talent questions on this team. They're 28th in the offensive line rankings heading into the year. That receiving core kind of looks a lot like Carolina's from last year, which is concerning. Okay, they've got multiple rookies as opposed to just Jonathan Mingo last year for the Panthers, but you could easily imagine that receiving core being a major problem again. The defense, as we said, is question marks all over the place, and we don't know who the starting quarterback is going to be yet, whether it's going to be Brissett as a bridge, whether he's going to play the whole year as a bridge, or whether Drake May gets thrown in sooner rather than later. So, maybe this regime will work its way to a good place, but I imagine year one being a pretty ugly season for the Patriots. And honestly, this is a team that could be on its way to the number one overall pick next year.
Yeah, I agree. And I think then the good thing about that is if they are that bad this year and it's that much of a rebuilding year still, they don't have to take a quarterback, right? You could sit there and take a left tackle. You could take the best defense. You could just take the best player in the draft, because next year, quarterback won't be the best football player in the draft. Not like it was this past year, right? Where the first 3 and 6 of the first 12 went. That's not going to be the case next year. It's not as quarterback heavy. You can go the best defensive player. You could take a franchise left tackle. You could take a number one receiver. And that's what this is about, right? You mentioned the split between how it affects them in 2024 and beyond. And I think the and beyond part of that is the big focus here, both with how they're handling Drake May, if Brissett's going to start early, with the development of the weapons, with the direction the defense is going, every bit of that. Like, if you're judging the Patriots as a team just in 2024, even if they get the number one overall pick, it's really not the worst outcome, right? Like, I don't think they're actually, it sounds funny, but nobody's expecting anything of them. They're trying to develop a quarterback. There really isn't a worst outcome for this team, because even if they have the worst record in the league, then they're going to come out with either the best player in the draft or a franchise left tackle or something that really, really helps them with that and beyond part. So I don't think there's any bad outcomes. It's just going to hurt for a little bit, right? Or around New England and around Boston, where you go, oh, okay, this is what it's like without Belichick, and this is what it's like to rebuild for the first time in 30 years.
All right, that's going to do it for today's run around the teams with new head coaches heading into the 2024 NFL season. Dalton, big thanks for showing up on the podcast today and talking through all that. We will be back next Monday with Steve reporting from what he saw at Patriots training camp. Maybe it's not as dire as we've been talking about. Until then, thank you all for watching and listening, and we'll talk to you next week.